Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. This one's going to be a little bit different. I won't be doing any historical knitting or sewing, but I hope that you're still interested based on the fact that you decided to actually watch this video. In my corner of the world, at the height of spring and summer, there's this really bright yellow flower that blooms all across the fields and on the sides of roads, really anywhere where it can try to gain some foothold and sprout up. This plant is technically considered a noxious weed, but after looking into it, I found out that it's actually something called Dyer's woad, which has been used for centuries across Europe and I believe in the Americas to dye fabrics and yarns a rich blue color. I was really fascinated after learning that this was Dyer's woad, so I decided to look into it a little bit more, and there is quite a lot of evidence of the use of Dyer's woad across the centuries in Europe. So for example, if you look at the Hallstatt burials, the people were buried in cloth dyed blue with Dyer's woad. If you are familiar with the tapestry, The Hunt of the Unicorn, there are a few areas of blue thread that are used across the tapestry, and that blue is actually indigo extracted from Dyer's woad. One of the more fascinating things that I came across is actually a book published in 1655, which I think is the earliest instance of a knitting pattern, at least published in English. And that book not only contains patterns for knitting different items like stockings, but it also contains recipes on how to dye your yarns different colors. And it contains recipes for dyeing your yarn blue using Flory blue, which is actually indigo from Dyer's woad. So from those few examples, I could definitely tell that Dyer's woad was used quite frequently throughout the centuries in Europe, but is it historically accurate technically to knit something from the 1890s? No. Dyer's woad is not the only plant source of indigo. There's actually a plant called true indigo, which has a far higher concentration of indigo in its leaves. True indigo was much more commonly used in Europe and the Americas after trade routes were established with Asia, which is where that plant was used for blue dye. Later on, in the mid-1800s, a process was invented to synthetically create indigo, and in the late 1800s, that process was industrialized. By the time of where my ensemble fits in the timeline in the late 1800s, Dyer's woad would not have been used at any kind of scale to dye yarns blue. However, because Dyer's woad is so abundantly available where I am, and by ripping up a few of the plants in order to create my dye, I'd actually be doing my area a favor by removing a noxious weed, I knew that I had to try my hand at using a natural plant dye extracted from Dyer's woad in order to dye my yarns blue to create a fascinator and a miser's purse for my 1890s walking ensemble. In order to gather the Dyer's woad, I decided to first weave my own basket made out of reeds. It actually ended up being the perfect size to gather the leaves that I needed. Dyer's woad is a biennial plant, which means that it lives for 2 years. The first year plant is a small rosette of gathered leaves, and the second year plant is actually the one that sprouts the flowers and eventually drops the seeds. For dyeing purposes, the first year plant is actually the one with a higher concentration of indigo and is the one that you want to target. The perfect time is also sometime in the early summer, so I started picking the woad plants around mid-June. As this was my first time dyeing with woad, I wasn't exactly sure how much to gather. I did have a few tutorials that I found online that I was trying to follow and aggregate the information. I will leave the links down below to the ones that I used, and so I ended up gathering a few basketfuls of leaves and storing them for a few days until I had gathered what felt like enough to dye the quantity of yarn that I wanted to dye. I was quite excited after gathering some of the larger leaves as I was actually getting some blue tint on the bottom of the stems, and I actually got a few blue spots in the basket that I was using to carry the leaves where it got dyed blue from the indigo in the stems. I'm planning on dyeing 2 different types of wool. One is a simply wool in worsted weight, and the other is a silk wool called luminance, and that's a lace weight yarn. I'm planning on making a fascinator with the worsted weight yarn and a miser's purse with the lace weight yarn. I know that technically the silk luminance yarn is already blue, but it's quite a light blue, and I'm hoping to deepen that color a little bit before I make my miser's purse. Before preparing my leaves for dyeing and extracting the indigo, I needed to soak my yarn, so I undid my yarns from all of their bundles and let it soak in shallow pans of warm water. I made sure to take the time to squeeze the air bubbles out of the yarn as best as I could. This allows the eventual dye to soak up more evenly in the final product, or at least that's what I read. Now the next step of this process is actually where I'm working on indigo extraction, and it required a lot of boiling water, almost 5 gallons worth of boiling water to be exact. Indigo extraction is actually quite an exact process, not just the extraction of the indigo, but making sure that it gets transformed into a chemical composition called indigo white that's able to actually adhere to your yarn before oxidizing and turning back into indigo blue. I don't know if you know this, I don't think I've ever shared this before, but I am actually technically a chemical engineer by training, which is part of the reason why I called my channel Engineering Knits. And I have done a lot of chemistry labs in my past, but they were definitely not my strong suit, so I was a little bit worried about how this would turn out. I decided to do my first ever yarn dyeing process with a notoriously difficult natural dye. I decided to forage on anyway and thought, you know, what's the worst that could happen? We'll just see if any yarn actually changes any colors at all. So after boiling all of my water, I took all of the different leaves that I had collected and put them into the 5-gallon bucket. Now, as you can probably tell, these leaves are really dried out. I took a lot of time to gather what I thought was enough weight of leaves to actually be able to have enough indigo to change the color of the quantity of yarn I was trying to dye. In reading some of the different instructions that I've seen, others have in the past successfully been able to use dried woad leaves or plants in order to do this indigo dyeing. So I thought that this would be okay to try. As carefully as possible, I then poured the pots of boiling water over the leaves. Now, I say boiling, but I'm actually at a few thousand feet of elevation, and the perfect temperature I think for the water is around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And where I am, water boils at just above 92 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit, so I think that for where I am, boiling water is actually just the right temperature for the woad leaves. After covering the leaves with just about 5 gallons of water, it was time to let it steep, basically like a fantastic dyeing tea. And you were supposed to put on the lid, excluding as much air as possible, so you wanted some liquid to spurt out as you closed the lid. I think I went a little overboard with the amount of water that I added because I don't think I had some liquid spurt out. I think it was a waterfall over the side of my bucket, but I did end up excluding as much air as possible, so I think at least that was a good thing. After letting my dyeing tea steep for about 45 minutes, it was time to move on to the next step of the process. First, it was important to strain out all of the leaves that were currently in the bucket. After removing all of the leaves and debris from the bucket, it was time to bring the pH to the alkaline level. You wanted a pH of somewhere between 9 and 10. I feel quite lucky that we happen to have pH strips in the house, so I was able to practice some more of my chemical engineering history and my chemistry lab skills in testing the water in the bucket for its pH level versus the soda ash I had dissolved in water in order to make the entire bucket solution more alkaline. I've also read that if you have a mixture that is too alkaline, it'll actually reduce the strength and integrity of your fibers that is based on protein, so animal fibers. After I was able to get the mixture to what I thought was an acceptable pH level, it was time to aerate the mixture. Now, other people have done this on the stove with a hand mixer, and I think I could highly recommend that because a 5-gallon bucket of water is over 40 pounds. So this was the most intense workout that I think I've had in a long time because you have to aerate the mixture for at least 10 minutes. Then it was time to add the reducing agent. I used thiourea dioxide and let it sit for another approximately 45 minutes. And once the 45 minutes is up, you open up the top. Now you can see here that I am vigorously stirring the solution because the solution is supposed to be like an olive green color. And it says that if it's a yellow color, it is far too over-reduced. And I tried to save this batch by adding more oxygen back into it. Hoping that I had somehow maybe saved this particular batch of what I had unfortunately done horribly wrong with it somehow, I decided to try dyeing the yarns anyway. And what I was hoping to see was after I take the yarns out of the batch, they would be a yellow-green color and quickly oxidize to more of a blue-green color. So as you lift the yarn out of the batch after being in there for about 10 minutes, it should oxidize and quickly turn blue. 10 minutes, I took my yarn out of the bucket and held my breath to see if any oxidation would actually occur that would turn any surviving indigo white into indigo blue. And as you can probably tell, nothing like that was actually happening, and I won't lie, I was quite disappointed. It's not a horrible color. You can see it's more of that pink green. I ended up with pink yarn rather than blue yarn. It's a lovely, dusty, rosy pink that I still think will end up looking absolutely beautiful. I've actually picked out a pattern to knit as a present for someone, and it is a 1920s sweater, so I will be working on that. I could also post a video of me making that particular sweater if you're interested. It's from a totally different time period of what I usually work on, but if you'd like to see me knitting a 1920s sweater, please let me know. After the disappointment of that first batch, where I spent many weeks gathering enough woad and an entire day working on the dye batch only to have it go in an unexpected direction, I decided that I would try it one more time. And I was able to pick in one morning enough woad to fill my entire 5-gallon bucket. So I was able to redo the entire process, but with completely fresh woad leaves that I tore into about 3 or 4 pieces each. This time I also made sure to rinse the leaves incredibly well. What I noticed the last time I did this dye batch is that my bucket had rocks on the bottom, and some of the rocks can actually attract the indigo to attach to the rocks and sediment instead of your yarn. I followed the same process as last time and added boiling water on top of the leaves to create my dyeing tea and let that steep for about 45 minutes. It was really exciting opening the lid back up because I saw almost like a blue tint to the water, like a blue hint and tinge to the water. And now it was time to try to increase the pH again to make my solution alkaline. And what I noticed right away is when I dipped my pH paper in and I took it back out is everything was stained completely blue. So that was a really exciting moment because at that point I knew I had successfully gotten indigo in the water in this batch somehow. After making my solution alkaline, I had to aerate the batch again for 10 minutes. So it was time for another workout, but this time what really got me through it was the fact that I was starting to see absolutely bright blue foam starting to form at the top of my buckets. After adding much less of the reducing agent this time, it was time to exclude as much of the air that I could from this batch and let it sit for another 45 minutes to allow the reduction reaction to take place. I breathed a huge sigh of relief this time when I opened up the bucket and not seeing that absolutely yellow color, so I couldn't wait to see what would happen when I actually put the yarn in. I luckily had more of the same wool that I had already used available, but I only had the one skein of silk yarn, so I used the already slightly pinked dyed, previously light blue dyed yarn, and I decided at the last minute to try to dye it over again with this particular indigo batch. I let the yarn sit for 10 minutes in the mixture, and I'm a little disappointed that in my absolute excitement from seeing the yarn actually coming out blue that I forgot to hit record when it was first being pulled out of the batch, because it's so surreal to see it change from this light yellow-green color to immediately oxidizing to this beautiful blue that you can see here. So I followed some of the suggestions that I found in the directions of doing successive dip dyes of the yarn. So I did 10 minutes of the yarn in the indigo batch, and then 10 minutes I let it oxidize in air. For the 3 wool skeins, I decided to do 2 dips, and for the silk that had already been previously dyed, I decided to do that 3 times just to see if I could get a slightly darker blue color. After I finished all of the dip dyes of the yarn, I let it dry overnight without any kind of rinsings. The next morning, it was time to rinse out the yarns. The first wash that I decided to do, or the first rinse, was in a slightly acidic solution to bring the overall pH of the yarn back a little bit closer to neutral. After that, I rinsed it in some soapy water after a final cold water rinse, trying my best not to agitate the water too much because I really didn't want to felt my wool. And I can tell you that I was absolutely giddy when the yarns were drying over my railing. I had washed these yarns and proven that the colors are actually very color fast, and I had extracted indigo dye from what is technically classified a noxious weed where I live, and created this beautiful blue yarn for me to make a fascinator and a miser's purse with. And even the pink yarn that I managed to dye, I will be using for a beautiful 1920s sweater. Before I let you go, I wanted to say that I just really love watching yarn dyeing videos, and my absolute favorite part is when they take the yarn that they've dyed up and they actually knit a sample swatch just to see what it would look like in the finished pattern. So I decided before I left you all that I would wind up at least one of each color and knit up a sample swatch to show you guys what beautiful blue I was able to dye, and also the lovely dusty pink color that I was able to get from the same exact plant, just getting slightly different results. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I am really excited to use these yarns in my upcoming projects, and in my next one, I think you'll actually see me using this blue yarn to knit my fascinator. I hope that you will tune back in next time when I'll be using the blue wool to knit my fascinator.